and gentlemen, can you all hear me? All good, all hear me back, fantastic. Thank you very, very much for joining us at the Institute of Economic Affairs this evening. And also, this is our first ever live IEA podcast. So thank you to anyone who's watching online. I hope there are a couple of you at least. Today's been a big day, obviously, budget day. It's sort of like Christmas Day at Economics Think Tank. We get very excited about it. And a big shout out to the OBR for giving us a little sneak preview today as well, which is very, very welcomed when we are trying to react as quickly as possible. If they can tell us in advance, then that's just perfect. But it turns out that most of it was leaked in advance anyway. Now, quick rundown of how things are going to run tonight. I'm going to briefly hand over to our incoming Director General on my left here to give some opening remarks, and then we will hand over to two of our greatest thinkers at the IEA to join me for a more in-depth discussion for the rest of the evening. There will be a good ample chance for people in the room to have contributions, ask questions, that sort of thing, and also for people to do the same online. So if you're watching on YouTube, on Substack, then please do leave comments in the appropriate places and we will get to them. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Frost.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm not really here yet, as Callum said. I'm not really starting until January, but I thought I ought to come and just say really a few words before we get going without getting in the way of the main event and the real experts on this subject. I think I just want to say two things, really, to kick this off. One general and one about the budget that we've come to talk about. The general thing is I suppose, an obvious point, that the case for markets, for freedom, for free enterprise and all of that has gone by default over the last 20 years or so. We didn't really expect to hear much of it today, I guess. But it's not really well embedded on the right of politics either, in my view, nowadays. And I think on the right, even now, even though there are some glimmerings of belief that a wrong direction might have been taken, there's still a very strong tendency amongst what we hear from the right, from the Conservatives, from Reform, from others, to kind of wish to hold the tiller and to direct and to know best. And there is still a very strong reluctance to kind of step back and let other people get on with things and sort of see what happens in the economy and in our political life. And that fact, I think, is a consequence of the fact that the battle of ideas has to a large extent been lost over the last 20 years, not entirely, but to a very large extent, and we need to fight it again, and we need to try and win it again, because it's the only way the country will become prosperous again. And that's really why I'm here, is to do my best to contribute to that battle of ideas. And all of you here, all of you listening online, either now or whenever this comes out, because I think it's going to be recorded, do please come and help us contribute to the cause. If you're listening and you've got lots of money, then think about giving some of it to the IEA. But even if you haven't, contribute yourself or your ideas and join the debate, because boy do we need it at the moment. Second thing really is just to say a word about today and framing, I suppose, for the discussion that's to follow. Obviously, it was an awful budget. I think that kind of goes without saying, but still I'm going to say it. If anyone's seen my piece in the Telegraph today, you'll see that point expanded upon. But really, that is the main point. And I think I would just highlight three things at this point about it. One, the obvious point that tax and spend have gone up again, despite the promise that they wouldn't, and in fact taxes at the highest ever level, I think, in this country. So obviously that's all bad. Second, the particular version of tax and spend that's been chosen is also pretty bad. And this invention of lots and lots of new taxes, the return of the investment income surcharge, all the kind of new ideas that have come out are also bad, because they're more intrusion of the government into the economy and into the way it works. So that's the second thing. And third, I suppose, is there's kind of no sense of vision I mean, we didn't really expect one, but there is a kind of socialist vision of the world. There is a Keynesian vision of the world, and even that, I think, is not particularly well sort of communicated today by the government. You know, the simple vision is more state control, more direction, more state doing things, albeit badly, is the way out of the problem, and obviously that is a complete fallacy, I think, the way we want to go. So to conclude, you know, we obviously aren't going to succeed doing this. We all know that. We're obviously going to have to wait out this government for however long it takes. It can only get worse, I guess, unfortunately, over this period. But to come back to where I started, we've got to be ready with an alternative. So, you know, whatever the next government is, whatever configuration of forces, you know, it needs to be as free market liberal. It needs to be more convinced of the value of freedom as we can make it. And that means fighting the arguments now and trying to prepare the ground so they don't seem weird, they don't seem outlandish, they seem kind of normal and the right direction to go. And that's really the goal for the next couple of years. So I shall stop there with those sententious remarks and hand over to the main event in terms of Christian and Chris. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. Now we're going to be joined by, so on my far left here is Christian Niemitz, Dr. Christian Niemitz, who's our editorial director here at the IEA. And in the middle here is Chris Snowden, Dr. Chris Snowden, who is our head of lifestyle economics, our two erudite researchers who are going to pour over the detail of today's events with me. Christian, I'll start with you. Let's start with some sort of headline takeaways, then we'll dive into the detail. Christian, what did you make of it? Lord Frost said it was awful. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. And somebody once said, I wish there was a way of knowing that you're in the good old days while they're still ongoing, before they are over. And you could say, you know, 2019, I never thought I would talk about that period, the year just before the pandemic, as the good old days. But I think it's fair to say that if we still had the fiscal situation that we had then, we probably wouldn't be having this event this evening. So back in 2019, public spending was about 40% of GDP, the budget deficit was about 2%, and borrowing costs, so the risk premium for government bonds, was about in line with other developed economies, or maybe marginally better than the average. Now, public spending is about 45% of GDP, budget deficit is more than 4%, and risk premiums are among the highest in the developed world. So the fiscal situation has really quite markedly deteriorated. And it is this increase in public spending that is the reason why this budget today was all very foreseeable. It's not because they've leaked so much. Okay, you can leak specific measures, but before any leaks, it was obvious that there was going to be big increases in taxation for the simple reason that when you raise public spending by 5 percentage points of GDP, and you don't raise taxes to anything like the same degree, and you have an ongoing budget deficit and bond markets getting nervous, well, there's only one way to go. What else did people expect? So this is really just, well, the increase in spending is a combination of two things. Part of it is the result of deliberate political decisions. So it was a political choice, of course, to spend a lot more money on the NHS. That's something that the Labour Party has always talked about while in opposition. And in part, it's about, well, accidental things, really. So the increase in spending on working age benefits, that is not something that anyone consciously planned. It's just that once it had happened, it turned out that they're not really willing to reverse it. This is where we see a government spending ratchet effect. So this is where we had the U-turn earlier this year, where they tried to control welfare spending but couldn't get it through, and something similar happening on old age benefits. And well, what's left? I mean, then there's the issue of growth. I mean, that's basically the reason why they initially thought they wouldn't need either tax rises nor spending cuts. It would just be elevated economic growth, productivity growth, bailing us out. And that doesn't seem to be going anywhere either. If if you want to be totally fair to them, you could say, well, okay, this was a budget, this was purely about fiscal measures, this is about public spending and revenue, not about growth. You can get growth in other ways, you can get it through regulatory measures. That doesn't have to be a topic for budget day. But then again, you would expect, if there was something somewhere, you would expect an allusion to it at least, some hint. Rachel Reeves could have said, I'm not going to talk about regulatory measures today, but let me just say, or something like that. Quite the opposite. There was, in the first 5 minutes or so, she said something about how we've sorted out the planning system. I think those were, or we've overhauled the planning system. Those were her words. And I thought, what, do they really think they've done it? Do they think this is it? Do they think they've done what they wanted to do on the regulatory side, where they initially said this is where the growth impulses are going to come from? Is this really it? Do they think they've already delivered the growth agenda that they were talking about? And finally, another thing that I've noticed about today's budget is, well, there were a couple of measures that were not huge in their own right. So measures that taken together raise a little bit more than 2 billion, but which I'll nonetheless single out for a second because I think they tell us something about where we are in terms of economic policy debates. So there was the, well, you could call it a quasi-mansion tax, an idea that's been around for a long time. It's now going to be, it's going to come in the form of a surcharge on the top council tax bands. And there will be higher rates of well, income tax on income derived from asset ownership, so savings, dividends, property, basically rental income. Why are they doing that? This doesn't raise much money, and even before you take account behavioral effects, which is of course always a risk. And so this looks like a pointless measure. If you came back from, say, having spent a couple of years abroad, you would wonder, why do they even bother with this? Why do they do this? And I think it's quite obvious. This is a consequence of the fact that this hype around the taxation of wealth that we currently have. At the moment, you can't watch a political program without seeing either Zach Polanski or Gary Stevenson banging on about the wealth tax. The announcements that we saw today, this is the sort of thing that you would do if you say you don't believe in wealth taxes yourself, but you want to offer something to people who do. You don't want to really do it, but you want to somehow send a signal to these people. That's the kind of pointless measures that we get, and basically this is the summary. No growth, endless tax rises, and in addition, Gary Stevenson and Zach Polanski are now setting the agenda.
Chris.
Well, I'm often wrong about politics with my predictions, and I was wrong about this government, because I did think they would, just because of the sheer economic forces against them, have to go for growth and not cut taxes. I didn't expect that, but I thought they would try and, like Christian says, generate the tax revenue through growth, and that they would get to grips with things like the planning system and also welfare reform. And they haven't done that. And they haven't done that, I think, for two reasons. The first is really that kind of frog and scorpion thing. It's just not in their nature to not spend a lot of money. And the Labour Party have always spent a huge amount of money. They find it very difficult not to. And the second is just the sheer politics of it, which sometimes at the IEA we can forget about the political pressures. And I try and put myself in Rachel Reeves' shoes. But she got, I mean, the turning point, I think a lot of people would agree with this government already, was when they backed down on the fairly small amount of welfare reform, £5 billion, pretty much nickel and dime stuff, but they couldn't get that past the backbenchers. And that sent a signal, which I think has been proven correct today and many other days, that the government wasn't really able to do anything because of the backbenchers being more left-wing, broadly speaking, than the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And so what I think we're seeing now, even though we're quite early really in this election cycle, is Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves adopting a core vote strategy, really, not unlike Rishi Sunak before the election when he was talking, the quadruple lock or whatever it was, the triple pension plus, and we're going to send young people to do national service because our core vote apparently is OAPs. And I think Rachel Reeves thinks, probably with some justification, that her core vote are welfare claimants and public sector workers. and she's trying to appeal to those people along with the Labour backbenchers. Why else would she find 101 different ways to tax people, every one of which is going to annoy some constituency here or there? I just walked past a lot of farmers coming down the street tooting their horns on a Wednesday night. You know, that inheritance farm tax thing is going to cost, it's just going to bring in, supposedly, if you believe the OBR, £500 million a year. The child benefit, two-child benefit cap is going to cost the government £3 billion a year. There are over 100 Labour MPs now who have rural seats. At the last election, I believe it was 2. These are marginal seats. If you believed you could win them, you would be not taxing farmers' inheritance, right? But they've given up on it. They're focusing on the core vote. Why is this two-child benefit cap such a big deal? Why is it worth spending another £3 billion in it when even Labour voters, if you look at the opinion polls, even Labour voters support this cap? People in this country, no matter who you vote for, are not very keen on what they see as welfare scroungers. So there doesn't seem to be any obvious vote in it, particularly not in marginal constituencies, but the Labour backbenchers don't like this. And welfare claimants, obviously, don't like this. And so what we've ended up with, I think, is a sort of death by 1,000 cuts approach, in which you just try and get a few hundred million here, a few hundred million there, from all sorts of different people. As I say, antagonising them as you do it, rather than do what, frankly, if I was in her position and I really felt I couldn't cut anything, and I certainly could cut lots of things, but it's the Labour Party, not the IEA. If you had to do what she was doing, I would be much more happy sticking 5p on petrol, putting 2p on income tax, and scrapping the triple lock. Now that would break 2 manifesto commitments, and obviously that would be politically difficult. But those 3 things alone, I haven't quite run the numbers, I think those 3 things alone would more than do what she's trying to do in terms of bringing in revenue, and probably give her a lot of headroom as well.
I think the political question is an interesting one. We won't dwell on it because it's not our job here at the IEA, but working out what their motivations are. You say that they're sort of going for the core vote strategy, which might be right, but I think it may be even more short term than that. They've basically pitched it at 2 key audiences, and those 2 key audiences are the 2 key audiences that could give Richard Reeves and the Prime Minister a P45, and they are the Labour backbenchers and the bond market. So they've satisfied the bond markets by doubling the headroom, and fair play, that's a sensible thing to do. No one in this room, I don't think, would have done it in the way that they did it, but they have done it. And they've satisfied the Labour backbenchers by scrapping the two-child benefit cap, which, as you say, isn't necessarily that popular with voters, and by, earlier in the year, by U-turning on the welfare reform. But I want to go back to the growth question. So your argument, Chris, and I think you're basically right, is that it's in their nature. It's not in their nature to be pro-growth. But I agree with you that
it's not in their nature to cut regulation.
Yes,
or cut taxes, yeah.
A year ago, I was also quite excited, and we were quite excited on the IEA podcast and in the IEA more broadly about, hang on, they are talking quite a good game here about growth, about saying no to the blockers, about taking on the planning system, etc. And that is a key part, if not the whole story, but a very, very key part to driving economic growth. Before the election, they would have answered the question about how you're going to pay for all this. Well, we're going to boost economic growth. That's how we solve all these problems. That's how we get out of this fiscal doom loop. Earlier on in the year, growth is our #1 priority. Speeches in factories in the north about how we're going to get growth. And this is a bit of a silly way of measuring it, but I think the word growth was mentioned just over half as many times as it was last year today. And the OBR themselves have said there was no measure in the budget that will boost growth. And you mentioned, Christian, that regulation, etc., doesn't necessarily come into the budget, but you can do some pro-growth tax reform. So do you think, Christian, they've fully given up on the growth mission, and they're just now, rather than looking to grow the size of the pie, they're just sort of divvying it up between their core voter bases?
It seems that way, yes. This seems to be very much a kind of budget that's driven by zero-sum thinking. And the trouble with that, of course, I've said that in essence it's the likes of Zach Polanski and Gary Stevenson setting the agenda. The trouble is just that the reason why these people have such a big platform nowadays is that we've had no growth to speak of for 18 years or so. So if you have a zero-sum economy, then fiscal and economic policy decisions really do become more zero-sum. It does become about dividing a fixed pie, and that, of course, strengthens people like that. And this is what gets us into a doom loop where you then try to appeal to those people and adopt the kind of measures that we saw in today's budget. And that makes the initial problem even worse. And then you get from almost zero-sum to literal zero-sum. And what else was I going to say? Well, yes, like Chris, I never believed that the Labour Party had suddenly fully converted to YIMBYism, to a pro-abundance strategy. But I did believe that they would do it not out of conviction, but simply because they have nowhere else to go. When they're faced with a situation where they don't want to cut spending, probably can't do it for political reasons, they don't want to really raise taxes either, well, what's left to do? Then YIMBYism would be the way out. You double down on that. And why they've given up on that so quickly, I don't really know. It doesn't even make sense on the core voter strategy, because surely you could say younger voters are part of their core vote. That's where, normally that's where Labour does well. It's among voters under the age of 50.
Last year at the budget...
Well, yeah.
It's right.
Young people like us.
Yeah, quite. Last year at the budget, Rachel Reeves, I remember, stood up and said in 2024, I think the OBR had forecast a 0.2 percentage boost to economic growth, to GDP growth, purely from the planning reforms that they'd announced. And she I can't remember the exact line, but it was along the lines of, at no cost, we have increased growth by this amount. It's like, great, you've described it, Christian, as it's like finding 20 quid on the floor and just picking it up. It's free money. Planning reform is free money. And they've recognised that themselves, but they haven't gone down that path. Anyway, let's get back to focusing on the actual budget, and let's go through some of the measures that were announced today. First of all, the biggest, so they've raised £26 billion worth of extra taxes. The biggest single measure was the stealth tax increase, freezing the income tax thresholds for 3 years. Chris, what's your take on the growth effects of that? Is that how you would have gone about it? You mentioned an alternative path earlier. Is this a less harmful way of raising 8 billion quid, or pretty down the drain?
If the question is how do you raise 8 billion quid, then my answer is no, you should do what I said before, and indeed what Rachel Reeves apparently was going to do 3 weeks ago, which is stick 2p on the basic direct income tax. I think of all the ways to raise money, that would be the best way for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's actually income tax is a good tax as economists define a good tax. It's got a broad base, it's simple to collect, it's progressive, and what's the fourth one they all say?
It's predictable.
No. Never mind. The 3 is enough. 3 good things is enough, and there's also a fourth one. And if you do that, that has a number of added benefits. Firstly, it's it kind of makes everybody have a stake in things. You know, we've moved in such a progressive direction with the tax system that there are a huge number of people now, not just people on welfare, but a huge number of people in work who don't really care if taxes go because they don't pay them. And since apparently everybody wants more money to be spent on our precious NHS, I think everybody should be chipping in. And we're not talking a huge amount. 20% income tax is very low by international standards, as the resolution suddenly started tweeting on an almost hourly basis as soon as this idea was apparently being taken seriously in number 11. And the other benefit is it gets your wealthy pensioners to start paying a bit more tax. You start clawing back the triple lot that the government simply refuses to get rid of. Every party refuses to get rid of. You start clawing some of that back in a way that you don't really by just freezing the thresholds. The one advantage of freezing the thresholds is that you will get a lot of people in the public sector who consider themselves to be quite poorly paid, deputy headmasters and so on, suddenly, maybe not even that, just heads of departments, suddenly paying the higher rate of income tax, and that might give them a little bit of pause for thought.
Exactly. It sort of feeds into what Christian was saying, this narrative or this fallacy that you can actually just increase spending and put all the taxes on other people, but actually if you broaden the base of income tax, then everybody feels the pain of having to pay for those things. Chris, while we're on you, you're a bit of an expert on the lifestyle side of things, and there's been quite a lot of what we'd maybe call nanny state, or attacking things like gambling, tobacco, alcohol duty, etc. Could you run us through what's going on that side of the ledger, Is it raising enough money? And what will be the sort of broader effects of those taxes?
Yes, we often like to talk here at the IEA about the Laffer curve, and people on the left say the Laffer curve doesn't exist, but there's some very, very clear examples of the Laffer curve. One of them is tobacco duty. The duty has been going up and up and up for I don't know how many years now. It's been on this escalator of RPI plus 2%, sometimes 6% if the chancellor is feeling frisky. And this has led to very, very high tobacco prices. People who used to smoke and no longer do are always amazed when I tell them that a pack of cigarettes is now £17, probably £18 tomorrow. And the effect of this has been fairly predictable in that people are now just buying cigarettes for £5 on the black market. The consequence has been we have lost £2 billion in tobacco duty revenue in the space of just 3 years, and this is not because people are giving up smoking. The smoking rate has not gone down anywhere near as much as the decline in legal tobacco sales. So this is a classic example of taxes that's being pushed so high that people are evading and avoiding the tax. With the sugar tax, I mean, the sugar tax is just interesting just from a anthropological angle, really. I mean, the sugar tax was set, the lowest, there's two tiers of the sugar tax, and the lowest is set at 5 grams of sugar per 100 millilitres. And the government, under George Osborne, explicitly said we want the soft drink companies to take the sugar out, bring it below 5 grams, that's an acceptable amount, and it is, it's a very small amount of sugar, very small amount of calories. And so loads of them did, Iron Brew, Lucasade, San Pellegrino, lots of these brands reformulated their products, brought them below the 5 gram limit, but of course they didn't bring it very low below the limit because people actually quite like the taste of sugar, and the less sugar in a product, the lower your sales, I'm told. So they brought it down to about 4.6, 4.7, at which point the public health lobby got a bit shirty, saying, oh, they're gaming the system. So these are the words that Wes Streeting used, gaming the system. And so there was a discussion and a consultation earlier this year about bringing it down to 4 grams, which would just have, I mean, the sugar tax has had no public benefit whatsoever. Child obesity has continued to rise, adult obesity has continued to rise. The whole thing should just be scrapped. It's just taken £250 million out of people's pockets, and it's regressive. And so they had this consultation, and the Food and Drink Federation must have done their feeble lobbying, because in the end they ended up with this fudge of we'll make it 4.5 grams. We're going to lower the limit from 5 grams to 4.5 grams. What is the point? On any level, what is the point of this? And yet Wes Streeting was in Parliament yesterday saying, well, I will never turn my back on children who are living with obesity, and this is a terrible disease. And the Food and Drink Federation was saying, we're very delighted that the government has seen our point of view on this issue. And the Food Foundation said this is going to save thousands. This is unspeakably trivial. I mean, the sugar tax itself was pretty trivial. This is ludicrously trivial. And yet, even at 4.5, Pepsi, 7-Up, Iron Brew, they're all going to have to reformulate their drinks again. Spend millions of pounds reformulating the drinks, make them taste slightly worse, then advertise to try and convince people to keep buying them. And this is a government that is laser focused on growth. This is kind of, in a way, this is a microcosm of the problem on growth. Is in the abstract, they are keen on growth, but you give them the prospect of taking out 3 calories from a can of Fanta, and it's like, well, obviously we don't want to sacrifice the health of children. There's always something more important than growth. And then gambling, this is the big one today, is gambling. So, a concerted effort by a couple of think tanks, actually, and a multi-millionaire ex-casino player, weirdly enough, ex-poker player, to raise the tax on online gambling in particular. 10 years ago, there was no tax on online gambling. Then there was a 15% tax. And then 2019, it went up to 21%. Now it's going to go up to 40%. And this is not, whatever the government might say in its misleading comms, this is not a tax on profits. This is a tax on revenue, what they call gross gambling yield, which if you imagine you own a fruit machine, people put in £200. At the end of the day, you've got £40. The £40 is your gross gambling yield. I think everybody in here would agree that that is revenue, not profit. Okay? You get taxed on that. 40% of that goes straight to the taxman, plus another 1% for a gambling levy. After that, you then pay 25% corporation tax and all the other taxes that businesses pay. There are not many companies that could thrive or even necessarily survive with 41% taken from their revenue before they've paid a single overhead. But that is what is now going to happen to the online gambling companies, basically because they're not very popular. The effects of this, wouldn't like to predict. I've spoken to people in the gambling industry, and I'm aware that prior to a budget, these people will tend to gild the lily. But looking at the figures as I have, I don't see how these companies can survive in their current form. And a lot of people don't have any sympathy for online casino companies and so on. But it is, online gambling genuinely is a world-leading industry in this country. And it looks like Rachel Reeves is just going to kneecap them out of pure spite and ignorance about what's actually going on. In addition, there's going to be a very large rise in online betting duty, which will just lead to people getting worse odds. And what happens if you get worse odds? You go elsewhere. How do you go elsewhere? Well, get a VPN, just go on any other website in the world. So, the gambling industry sometimes call this the black market. That's hyperbole, really. These are legal websites, a lot of them, just operating outside of the Gambling Commission's jurisdiction. So the OBR, and we haven't even got onto them yet, but the OBR think that this is going to lead to another billion or more in tax revenue. We shall see. I don't think they will. In fact, I would bet against it.
It's 1.1 billion, I think they put against the gambling tax.
Yeah,
which
it won't happen. People will go on the black market, and a lot of these companies will not just leave. I mean, nearly all of them have left already to avoid corporation tax because they can't afford that on top of everything else. But I think some of them actually might just cease operations in the UK and focus on the rest of the world.
We've had an excellent question on YouTube that I was going to ask myself, but I will give the credit to @WhatADubhead, who has asked, Christian, what would the panelists suggest to cut in spending to cover the 30 billion quid? Which is the big question, right? So we're sat here discussing how best to raise revenue, but actually I think we would all agree that spending cuts should, could and can be the way that we should go. So how would you make up some of that 30 billion pound fiscal black hole through spending cuts?
Well, they were initially already on the right track. They tried to reform welfare spending. Again, we've talked about this many times on the podcast, that this increase in working age welfare, this is something which happened pretty much since the pandemic. It happened only here. It hasn't happened anywhere else in the OECD. So that shows you...
Not long COVID, is it?
No, it's really not. Well, if it happened everywhere, you would think, well, this is some sort of long-term pandemic effect. It's clearly not. If it just happens in one country, it cannot be that. And if you have lots of people claiming various out of work benefits and there is no obvious decline in population health on any other measure, then clearly there is something wrong with the system, and this is what they were trying to address initially, and were just immediately giving up on it, and there wasn't even that much protest against it. It was really just an internal thing. That it was mostly the backbenchers. So just go back to that, something that they initially themselves said we want to address. And then when it comes to old age benefits, you mentioned the triple lock, winter fuel payment, which can be means tested. These are things which I would have thought for Labour government are relatively easy to do, simply for the reasons that we've said before. Their voter base is basically millennials, Generation Z, and about half of Generation X. So young and middle-aged people. And this is their voter base. So for them, it's relatively easy to go to address old age benefits. And why they U-turned even on that, I don't know, it makes no sense even on its own terms.
It's just a bad look. Yeah, this lobbying now, pensions are freezing to death. Actually, if you're interested in the facts, excess mortality declined that winter before they repealed it.
Chris, any advance on scrapping the triple lock and going back to the pension, the welfare reform?
Well, the disability long-term sickness thing, it's such an easy thing to solve, I think. And I think if you got a bunch of think tanks in the room, both left-wing, centrist, right-wing, they would all agree that there are some really obvious things that the government should do. And the most obvious one, I think, is the welfare reform on the disability thing, because it's obviously just being scammed. I mean, it's been misused and exploited. Like Christian said, there is no genuine increase in the sickness, and nor is there any reason to think there would be. What happened is and it came back to the Tories again. The Tories basically wanted to get people off short-term sick, so they cut the short-term sickness benefit, but they didn't want to punish people who were trapped in a wheelchair for the rest of their life, so they increased the long-term sickness rate. And the fairly predictable consequence of that is that people, even if they were genuinely short-term sick, went, okay, well, I'll go on long-term sick. At which point it's quite difficult to argue, oh, I feel better now, but go off it, even if you wanted to. And a lot of them don't want to, because you get paid a lot more on that than you do on job seekers' allowance or on short-term sickness. A very simple, it's probably not the perfect solution, but a simple, quick fix would just be go back to the system that we had in 2018. Because we've seen, I could get these numbers wrong, because it's a while since I looked at them. I think we've seen a £45 billion increase in real terms in social security spending in just 2 years. That's her entire, black hole, whatever she calls it. One policy, or a couple of policies, because it also includes a triple Y. But a very simple thing there. Just undo the damage that was done by the last government. Something that she's claiming she's doing in every other way. You add that to maybe a little increase in the basic income. You can give the NHS all the money at once. And that's the other thing, by the way, on the politics is aside from trying to please her clients effectively and trying to please the backbenchers, she is quite rightly and understandably obsessed with getting the waiting list down for the NHS, because there is no way the Labour Party can come close to winning an election in 4 years' time if we have very high waiting lists. Unfortunately, the only way they know how to do that is to just throw money at the NHS, and that, which they will continue doing, largely in manifesting in large pay rises, I imagine, for the staff. But that's what it comes down to. She's just going to throw as much money as she thinks it takes at the NHS to say in 4 years' time we have fixed it. We are the party of the NHS. That is the number one priority for the Labour Party. Unfortunately, as we probably most of us in here realise, throwing money in the NHS doesn't really solve the problem.
Yeah, but on the working age welfare, it goes back to what I said in the beginning, that really today we don't need to talk about what the ideal libertarian budget would look like. We don't need to talk about some utopia that we have in mind. Going back to the way things were in 2018, 19, just before the pandemic, that would be a very different conversation today, or none. We might not even have this event.
But that leads me on to my final question before we go to audience questions. What would the ideal Christian Niemetz's budget look like? What if you were the Chancellor today, after chewing out the OBR for their early publication, and you'd get up in Parliament, what would be the sort of 3 top priority things that you would announce?
Well, whatever it is, I would get murdered 5 minutes afterwards. No, I would go for Javier Milei Afuera approach. I think I would just, rather than starting from the status quo, I wouldn't start from here is basically the answer. I would just rethink, well, what do we need a state for? That would not be zero. I'm not an anarchist. There would be some government functions that I think are legitimate, and they go beyond the night watchman state of the 19th century. But it would be, rather than just carrying on with everything we have, go back to first principles and just ask what is it that the state actually needs to do. But I realize that's not really a budget thing.
That's good though. You know, you're at an
the politicians answer that.
You know, you're at an IEA event when someone has to clarify that they do think there are some functions of the state that are legitimate. Chris, what would you do?
I'll be more specific. Well, firstly, there would be no state-owned education and healthcare. So that would massively reduce the amount that the government needs to spend. The Department of Education would just be subsidising people who can't afford to send their kids to the private schools, and the Department of Health would be doing the same for health insurance. So you wouldn't need to have tax rises in the first place. I would obviously get rid of the triple lock. I would ideally replace it with pensions going up in line with per capita GDP, which might give old people a bit of a reason to vote for pro-growth policies. And I think that would halve sin taxes at the very least, so everyone can have a good drink to get through these times. I think that would do for 1 year, and there'll be more to come next year.
You got my vote.
Yes. Yeah, on the healthcare stuff, I wrote something about this for our Substack Afuera series, that if we had, say, a private insurance system, but you make sure that everybody is covered by that. So you pay the premiums for people who can't afford them. And I assumed it would work more or less like in the Netherlands, where they have roughly a system like that. That would be something like 2 or 3% of GDP. And we now pay more than 10% of GDP on healthcare. So this is a large chunk that you could quite easily take out of the public sector, move most of it into the private sector, and have the residual state function would just be to make sure everybody is included in that private system.
And the same with education. Yeah.
Yes.
And also I'd scrap stamp duty, which everyone seems to agree is a bad idea. And I'd have 100% tax on craft beer.
We'll talk about that later.
Okay, on that note, there's loads that we haven't got into, but I do want to sort of open it up to contributions and questions from the audience. So please do raise your hand if you'd like to chip in, and somebody will come to you with a microphone. We have a gentleman down here at the front. Whose hand in there? Give us a second. There is microphone wrangling going on through there, I believe. Yeah, we have a first question down at the front here, Joseph, that's all right. There's a couple online as well, but we'll do a few in the room first. So.
Hi there. A lot of the commentary before the budget focused on a binary choice between raising taxes or reducing spending. But what about some of the other things she might have done? If she changed the rules about the Bank of England paying interest on deposits from the banks, or if, for example, she might have sold a few £100 billion worth of land, that would have given a whole bunch of money. Do you think she ever considered that?
Interesting question. Chris or Christian?
I don't know if she did. I don't know if I did particularly. Certainly not the land question. I don't know. People talk about selling off the family silver. I suppose that sounds a bit like it. What kind of land are you thinking, sir? Army land?
I just read some of the other day that there was something like £200 billion worth of land that we own as a government.
Let's build some houses on it.
Right.
Put a motorway through to it, and maybe a reservoir and a nuclear power station.
Yes, we can just grant planning permission on all of it. And
Yeah, I'm all in favour of new towns. Let's have some new towns. It's probably in the Highlands of Scotland, but still. High-speed rail to Glasgow, be all right.
Yeah, a lot of this, where the government owns land, I think this would not be a budget decision. This would be more about individual departments. But so this happened a couple of times that individual NHS trusts were selling land that they no longer needed. And a couple of years ago, I was approached by some medical journal. They asked me, do you want to write something about this? And I said, well, what's there to write about other than if they don't need it, then yes, they should sell it. That's good. That's it. And but apparently it was controversial because there were people saying, oh, but this means that the NHS is commercializing itself.
It's being privatized.
Yes, it's privatized through the back door because it's turning itself into a real estate company. But yes, obviously where public sector organizations have land or any other assets that they don't need, give them absolutely the option to sell them and use the revenue for something else.
That's a good idea. Anybody? Gentleman at the back with the raised hand there.
Hello. A lot of the conversation surrounding this budget seems to have been about bond markets getting skittish, but there seem to be an increasing number of left-wingers who are saying to themselves, well, why do we care about placating these banker bros anyway? I've read my modern monetary theory, or I've read tweets about it at the least. Why can't the government just order the Bank of England to lend to it at favourable rates? So what do we do to combat this very dangerous and seemingly rapidly becoming more popular narrative?
I'm glad you asked that. I'm glad you noticed that as well. I've noticed a lot of MMT people in my feed recently. I thought it was just because I was tweeting about it, but maybe it's just becoming... I think it's because Polanski alluded to it on the Laura Kuenssberg show on Sunday. I've got an article in The Spectator coming out whenever they get round to publishing the damn thing. I wrote it a couple of days ago, which will answer your question in full. But, I mean, it's just... like a wealth tax, which Polanski kind of made his name by calling for, is a bad policy for various different reasons. It doesn't fulfill any of the criteria, or any one of the criteria I mentioned before, which is it's progressive. It's useless in every other respect. It hasn't worked in other countries. But as a bad policy, it is within the kind of normal range of bad policy making. Whereas MMT is just absolute gibberish, and all the policies derived from it are insane. There's no two ways about it. There can be no common ground with somebody who believes in modern monetary theory because it's complete and utter nonsense. And you try, when people come to you with arguments, to steelman them in some way, and you just can't with that. It's just gibberish. They don't know what they're talking about. They have very, very bizarre ideas that all public spending is funded from newly printed money and tax revenue is destroyed in some way. And that we wouldn't have any money at all if it wasn't for the national debt, and the national debt is actually a treasured asset that our children and grandchildren will enjoy. I mean, this is it's just lunatic stuff, and it's quite worrying that the leader of any party, even the Green Party, goes along with it. But it's pretty obvious that he does, and maybe the role for the IEA now is just to debunk what are essentially conspiracy theories rather than trying to have an intelligent conversation about economics, because the general standard of understanding and debate of economics seems to be plummeting. But that may be just because I'm on Twitter too.
Yeah, we had a publication on this 3 years ago by Juan Castañeda, who, well, it's a critique of modern monetary policy, but he was remarkably patient with it, which I don't think you or I could have been. He took them seriously, was very generous with the MMTs, but just said, well, this just doesn't make sense. But the problem with MMT, I guess, is that, well, it overlaps, of course, a bit with Keynesianism, but it has a different psychological effect on people. Once people discover MMT, it makes them feel really smug about themselves, because you get this idea that I have discovered the one neat trick that nobody knows about, and it's a bit like a crypto scam also. Yes, it's exactly that. And so it has that psychological appeal. But yeah, essentially it's to the extent that there is a true core in it, it's entirely trivial. Yeah. They start from the observation that yes, there have been some periods when the money supply did go up and it didn't cause inflation, and that's when you have massive spare capacities in the economy that are not used. So during a recession, in a slump, and then it can be that if, say, the extra money mobilizes those resources, those spare resources that are currently not being used, and that gets economic activity up, then that absorbs the additional money supply, and then you don't have inflation. Okay, that's true. And in that way, that's also when a Keynesian argument can make sense, when you have massive spare capacities in the economy. It's just that what a lot of modern day Keynesians do is that they just apply this to any situation, regardless of where we are in the business cycle. So Keynes did not say you should always spend tons of money, or that everything the government spends always pay for itself. That's absolutely not what Keynes said. He was talking specifically about the depth of a recession, and even then it has to be a particular kind of recession. That can quickly get you out, but that is absolutely not the way in which you can promote long-term growth. That's not what Keynes said. And in the same way, when you're not in a Keynesian recession, when you're not in a situation where extra government spending can boost economic activity, then extra money printing cannot either. So in the situation when Keynesianism doesn't work, modern monetary theory doesn't work either. And most of the time, that's the situation we're in. If you're somewhere somewhere close to a normal economic situation, it is of course true that just creating more money is going to be inflationary.
We have a question online on a topic we haven't touched on yet, on the minimum wage. The minimum wage and the national minimum wage were increased as part of the budget. Damien Lindley has asked, do you think it's possible to get to a point where we can freeze the minimum wage, possibly at the same time that personal allowances are increased? Do you think we can get to a world in which the minimum wage isn't a thing that politicians reach for to get some sort of positive headlines and be a bit more sensible about it?
Well, yes, I mean, that would be a political choice. And it's an overdue one. I mean, we've had 15 years of very poor growth, and successive governments have dealt with that by being generous with employers' money, saying we're going to give the low-paid a pay rise. Well, where's the sacrifice from the government on this? And it's really starting to hurt employers. That and the national insurance on employers rise last year is having already an effect on unemployment. I'm very concerned about unemployment. It seems to me that the tomorrow's problem is always the thing that people think is solved, like inflation. You know, we had very, very low inflation for a long time. People just kind of forgot about it and just decided somehow central bankers have dealt with this. And so we casually just printed nearly £500 billion and expected it to have no effects, and of course it did. And now everyone's concerned about inflation, when I think actually they should be more concerned about unemployment. And that is largely, if not entirely actually, because of the way the government is just forcing employers to pay more and more money to their least qualified and least able employees.
Yeah, one of the problems with the minimum wage is that when it was introduced, some of the people who opposed it at the time were, you could say, overcautious. So that there were people saying this is going to cause mass unemployment. And then when that didn't happen, the pendulum swung too far in the opposite direction, that you had to support this saying, oh, look, this means that the minimum wage has no effect whatsoever. We can set it at whatever rate we like. And what has happened over time is that when it was introduced, initially in the late 90s, it was well below the median wage, and it has moved closer and closer closer to the median wage since then. I think it's now about 2/3 or so of
No,
the
it's about
median-
80%.
80% even. Well, and of course, even if it has no discernible effect at very low levels, that doesn't mean that you can raise it endlessly or that it will never have an effect anywhere on employment levels. But yeah, that was essentially the problem. And also the way in which it was set. That was initially quite apolitical, an expert commission, rather than a political decision. But now we clearly have the situation with youth unemployment rising, where it has started to bite, even though it didn't initially.
Gentleman at the back with a hand raised very highly, and then we'll come here a second.
I'm Brendan Ramfist, and I want to touch on something that was alluded to briefly earlier, which is about how a good tax has a broad base. And so I wanted to ask the panel about the prospect of simplifying the tax code, which of course is a lot of economists support it, but because of there's a lot of vested political interests who gain from certain carve-outs from the tax code, rather strongly oppose it. But the thing is, Britain's tax code, I believe, is like 12 times longer than the Bible. It's insanely complex with all sorts of loopholes. And I think the government is, from what I've read, missing on like £200 billion of revenue going to all these exemptions, deductions. So I want to ask the panel, how would they go about with simplifying the tax code?
Great question. Christian. Or Chris.
No, go on, Chris.
Yeah, I would start with a land value tax. I would roll all the property-related taxes into a land value tax, so not just council tax, but also business rates, stamp duty, capital gains tax on property, anything to do with land, roll it into a land value tax, and this can be done in a revenue-neutral way. And I would also merge income tax with national insurance. So one of the arguments against that some former colleagues also, so this is something on which people here are divided, or were at least in the past, that some people argue that rather than abolishing national insurance, we should just return it to what it once was, which is, well, an insurance system where if you pay in more, you get out more, and it's just that contributory element has been eroded over time. But I would say, well, once that's gone, that's difficult to restore. So insofar as it still has a contributory element, it's it's a binary one. Either you have paid for a certain amount and then you qualify for, either you've paid for a certain amount of time and then you qualify for X, Y, and Z, or you haven't, and then you don't. But if that's the only contributory element, then surely you could do the same thing just with income tax. If you merge them into one, and you could then say something like the state pension or whatever, or job seekers allowance, you could then say you qualify if you've paid income tax for however many years, and if you haven't, then you don't qualify for it.
I mean, it would be quite complicated to do it because the tax code is itself so complicated. But I mean, broad principles. Ideally, you want some kind of two-tier flat tax, really. You want to tax all forms of income at a rate of, say, 18% and a higher rate of 38%, whatever, I mean, however you depending on how much money you want to raise, basically, which under my system would be a lot less than currently. I think as a general rule of thumb, get rid of anything that's to do with social engineering or other causes that are actually not to do with tax collection. Most of these exemptions, loopholes, subsidies, and all the rest of it, they're because some politician has decided we must encourage such and such a behaviour, like the sugar tax, right? We can get rid of those pages straight away, sin taxes, various nudges, the climate change things, the exemptions for this and that, grandfathering things in and out. There's a huge amount to cut there, clearly. But I mean, if you were starting from scratch, you would certainly do a better job than the one we've been left with.
Thank you. More questions. So one at the front here has been waiting for quite a while, and then we'll try and hit everybody else in the room very quickly in the last 5 minutes. So down at the front here. You keep your questions very brief, and we'll rattle through them if that's okay.
Well, let me answer it. Right, I haven't seen or heard all that was in the budget. I just want you to clarify these things. Is she retaining the triple law? And is the cash ISA allowance still going to be kept at 20,000? Because there's a lot of speculation it will be brought down. And how much is the state old age pension going up by? And listen, I know you're opposed to the triple lock, but a lot of ordinary working class folk think that the state pension is a disgrace. Who can live in 12,500? And a lot of folk want to keep the triple lock. And the two main political parties and others said that they will keep it in their massive manifestos. And that other thing that you've just said, bringing back the investment income surcharge, can you give me the details of that? And will money that folk have in their ISAs be taken into consideration?
On the ISA one, what they've done is the £20,000 tax-free allowance is still there, but you can only use 12 of it in cash if you're under 65, 12,000 of it in cash. The other 8,000 has to be an investment if you're under 65. If you're over 65, it can all be in cash. That's the deal on the ISAs.
April 2027.
Yep.
Right, and
Okay.
On the triple lock, yes, it needs to go. The country simply does not have the economic growth and the national income to keep paying pensioners more than the rate of inflation. And you say, oh, they only get £12,500. Well, most of them don't, because most of them have a public sector pension or a private pension or other forms of income. It is true that some of them don't. And for those people, there should be some extra help. The problem with the triple lock pension is actually pensioners are doing extremely well on average, and some of them are extremely wealthy, in fact, and they're still getting this pension, which is not means tested. So at the very least, we need to look at means testing the pension, because we simply cannot have people who are in their 20s and 30s unable to buy a house, unable to do all sorts of things that these pensioners were able to do very easily, in order to keep giving people money who don't really need it in order to get a cruise.
We had gentleman here in the class. Thanks very much. We're going to have to move on to the last questions we've got. We'll do one, two, we'll do both.
Just a quick question from me. We haven't really touched on our energy policy, which I think is a real drain on economic growth in this country with the price of our energy, and also the missed opportunity that Rachel Reeves had in terms of the royalties and income that was being gained from the North Sea, which we're now consciously deciding we're going to pay that to Norway and Qatar and the United States. So I just wondered if the panel would like to comment on what they would do on our energy policy.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a paper coming out on the cost of net zero, and the way in which this whole thing started is bizarre in itself. So we had the Climate Change Act 2008, which was quite ambitious. It said by the middle of the next of this century, carbon emissions have to be cut by 80% relative to where they were in 1990. And okay, that was quite ambitious, but at least on its own terms, it worked for a while. Emissions were falling, and there was sort of a consensus. This is the policy now, and it had just disappeared from the headlines. It was no longer, climate policy was just assumed to be this thing that everyone agrees on, and there isn't really anything else that needs to be done on the political front. And then in 2018-19, maybe in that sense it wasn't the good old days, we suddenly had the Extinction Rebellion protests here all the time. We had the Greta Thunberg-inspired protests. And the whole political class suddenly seemed to be fawning over these protesters. They invited Greta Thunberg to Parliament, and that's when net zero was born out of this panic of being on the wrong side of history. And I even remember a Twitter discussion between a former colleague and some conservative politicians. So my former colleague was saying, well, net zero is rubbish. He said, I'm not a climate change denier. I would have a climate policy, but not a target to have it at zero at a specific date. And some conservative politician or commentator replied to him, come on, get on board with the zeitgeist. And I thought, no, the zeitgeist is wrong, because this was clearly a moment of mass hysteria, and even that seems to be fading. But then I said this before 2018, and then we suddenly did have that explosion in hysteria. But no, I'd say even if we got rid of net zero or even the Climate Change Act, we would still have a form of carbon pricing. It wouldn't mean that you could just emit as much CO2 as you want to. We have carbon pricing. We've had that since the mid-2000s, ever since it was introduced in the form of the emissions trading scheme. I say that's good enough, just leave it there. Let the carbon pricing, let that do its work, and do nothing else. Otherwise, if people want to produce energy, let them do it.
Excellent. We had, one, two. We'll start on this side because this gentleman's had his hand up for ages, and then we'll do 1, 2 and 3 after, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Thanks. So one thing I saw in this budget, which was super under the radar, was the freezing of both thresholds and the interest rates on student loans. It was previously, I think, 6.2%. They're freezing it at 7.9%, which is raising just 0.4 billion. What would your idea look like when it comes to improving the student loan system and that kind of thing? Because obviously it's really weird that the more you earn, the higher the interest rate is. Like, that's not like any loan I've ever known.
A lot of the universities should be closed down, so there'll be fewer people going to university. University, by and large, is a scam, a racket, I would say, for most people who go there. It really is genuinely exploitative of young people, fairly naive time in their life. They're sold the dream that they will be earning the kind of money that maybe their grandparents did if they went to university. Some people are very proud of being the first people going to university. They're sold a dream largely doing Mickey Mouse degrees at Mickey Mouse universities. And we should be, in a way, protecting them from this racket by discouraging higher education. There's absolutely no evidence that having more than half of the population now going to university is good for growth, as Tony Blair once claimed. And the rest of them, in my opinion, should have a higher threshold for paying back their student loan. I'm completely in favour of having student loans, but you can now work in McDonald's and have to pay off a student loan. I mean, the original idea was once you earned what was then called a university-type salary, then you start paying it back, and that's perfectly fair. If you're a doctor or something like that, start paying it back, fine, no problem. But what is it these days? It's like less than £30,000?
£25,000.
How much?
25,000.
25,000. So it's less than minimum wage, isn't it?
It's
not far off.
Just under minimum wage. With the raises, minimum wage becomes 26 grand a year. With the current rate, it's about £500 over.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just a racket, as far as I can see. I mean, the original promise of the student loan is like you only pay it back when you earn a certain amount of money. Has been shattered, which is good for other taxpayers, to be fair. And there's still billions of pounds that are being written off because apparently students can't even make that tiny amount of money. My wife, I shouldn't say this on TV, my wife was delighted after 25 years. She'd never paid back a penny of her student loan. She thought she'd got it over on the man in some way. So, well, this means you've been in low-paid work for your entire career.
Yeah, so essentially the universities need to become risk-bearing. They need to take on some of the risk of a student defaulting, so that if somebody then comes out of university and takes a non-graduate job, or if their graduate premium is basically zero, they earn about as much as they would have anyway, and they can't pay back their loan, well, it should be the university itself that takes some of the hit. And if they were on the hook financially for the results, then they wouldn't offer Mickey Mouse degrees. So we had a paper on this too a couple of years ago where somebody proposed, the author proposed, a financing model where basically the university gets a share of the future income of the students. So it's in their best interest to make sure that their future alumni, that they do well in the job market, and obviously there will always be some variation, and some people won't do as well as you thought, but that's basically then like an investment portfolio. You have in that you have some companies that do far better than you expected, and I don't know whether that's exactly the right mechanism to do it, but either way, the basic idea surely needs to be that the universities need to be financially dependent on how well their graduates are doing once they leave. That would very much change what sort of courses they offer in the first place, and also how they teach it. And to the extent that that's possible, they would maybe try to offer some career advice or things like that later on.
Absolutely. Now we are well over time, so we will go to these last two questions very quickly if we can keep questions and answers short and everybody can get to the bar. Lady at the front here on the second row here with her hand half raised.
I'll try my hardest to keep this as brief as possible. You discussed, Mr. Snowden, you discussed wealth tax to be an unprogressive and useless policy.
No, the wealth tax is progressive. It's just useless on every other measure.
Oh.
It's highly progressive. It's
Okay,
terrible. Very small base, very complicated, difficult to collect, all the rest of it.
Oh, okay, that clears up quite a bit of what I could.
To answer your question.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I was wondering, what's your opinion on people who make so much money whereby it's so difficult to even be able to spend it? So a lot of it ends up just in savings, investing, and just kind of almost hoarding and kind of out of circulation. I mean, wouldn't a wealth tax almost bring a lot of that money that's not being used back into circulation, therefore helping economic growth? So that was my question, but you kind of answered it.
Oh, yeah, it's not an unreasonable question. I mean, rich people obviously have a lower marginal propensity to consume, and so if all you care about is the money kind of swishing around the system, it would be better to give it to the poor. The trouble is you don't really get growth by money swishing around the system. Money swished around the system for thousands of years and you never had any growth. And also the money that is being invested, unless people are literally buying gold bars and burying them, it's going into the bank where people can then loan it. It's going into the stock market. It doesn't disappear, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that.
We had, I think, one person with their hand raised on the right-hand side. Yes, next to, and then we'll make this our last question before we wrap up.
You kind of touched on this a little bit already, but I was just wondering, how do you, with kind of Nigel Farage's populism agenda with immigration and then Zach Belansky's populism agenda with wealth tax, how do you think the rise in populism and populist policies will affect how the government and future governments will touch on the UK's economy, both now and in the future, especially with Labour's kind of half-assed tackling of the populism? They kind of attempt to touch on go for populist agendas, but they really fail to succeed on that, I guess.
Labour are in an impossible position trying to appease Green Party voters and Reform voters at the same time. It's just not going to happen. You kind of this thing will just pick a side, which in a way Rachel Reeves has done today. I mean, it's a fairly socialist budget, albeit with a bit of a chat about stopping the boats and taxing mansions. It's difficult. I mean, what's it going to mean in the long term? Well, I think probably one of those parties will probably get in and we'll have a populist government. I don't know. I mean, politics isn't really our thing here so much. We just hope that whoever's in charge has to adopt and wake up to some kind of economic reality along the way. And on that front, I'm a bit more optimistic about reform than I was a couple of years ago. I thought their manifesto last year was pretty ludicrous, to be honest with you, with many of the economic policies. And I'm glad that Farage seems to have dropped this idea of the £90 billion of tax cuts that were going to be magicked up from nowhere. But I don't know.
I think there's an element of, in the UK, the Conservative Party has historically done well being the sort of, we can't quite afford that party, the sort of actually, in 2019 Corbyn was promising free broadband and everyone sort of went, surely not. People sort of got that wasn't feasible. And I think that Farage moving to dropping his quite expansionary sort of £90 billion in tax cuts without any way to pay for it, him distancing himself from that is maybe a sign that there is a bit of a shift towards the idea that we do need to be fiscally prudent in some way. So hopefully that will hold. I think Rachel Reeves's attitude to the bond markets and wanting to expand that fiscal headroom is maybe a sign that there is that level of sensibleness running through the political parties at the moment. If it will sustain is a different question. Christian, do you have any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the left-wing and right-wing populism are two very different kinds of populism in the sense that one is primarily cultural and the other is economic. So you have, I say the populist right couldn't survive without an external trigger event, something that increases the salience of the things that they care about. And in the last couple of years, that has clearly been immigration, with immigration levels being about 5 times or so the annual net migration figures, what it was in the previous decade. Once that comes down, the appeal of the populist right will diminish. Then it moves onto areas where the Conservatives can compete with them. Whereas with the kind of populism that comes from the socialist left, that's a very different one, because that doesn't need a trigger event, right? The rise of Zach Polanski and Gary Stevenson, that hasn't been caused by a massive explosion in wealth inequality. I mean, wealth inequality, like income inequality, is completely flat. It's flat as a pancake. If you look at it as a graph, it has barely moved in decades, and these people have just created this issue. They just say it is a massive problem, and everyone just repeats it. They have created this out of thin air, so they have much greater agenda-setting power. So I'd be more concerned about the populist left than the populist right.
Thank you very much. Now, Chris Snowden has finished his whiskey, which means it's time to wrap up the conversation. Thank you, everybody in the room, for joining us. It's really great to see you all. I really appreciate you coming down this evening and for partaking in the discussion. Thank you, everybody online, for watching, for chipping in with questions and on the polls. If I expect many of you already do, and that's why you're here, but if you haven't, then do subscribe to our Substack and our YouTube channel. That's where all of our content goes out: research, publications, podcasts, events like this. The like, as Lord Frost mentioned earlier, if you do have a bit of extra spare money swishing around after Rachel Reeves has nabbed more of it, then do please consider donating to the IEA so we can keep up the free market classical liberal message. That just leaves me to thank both Christian and Chris for joining me tonight, and good night.